Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm so delighted to welcome you to this evening's virtual conversation. And our conversation tonight is going to be with Dr. Robert P. Jones about his new book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. And my name is Emma Jordan-Simpson, and I am the Executive Director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the Executive Pastor of the Concord Baptist Church of Christ here in Brooklyn. And I am absolutely delighted and honored to be tonight's moderator. Before I introduce Robert, I want to invite all of you to share your questions with us tonight by typing them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them as the program is running along tonight. I also want to thank the Brooklyn Historical Society for hosting this conversation tonight, and that it falls tonight when we really need to have a conversation that hopefully will help us look toward the future is just a blessing. And I want to remind you all that we are going to put in the chat a link to the community bookstore, which is located here in Brooklyn. We'll put that link in the chat, and you'll be able to purchase a copy of White Too Long, and you'll be able to get it from a local bookseller. So thank you for being with us tonight. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Robert Jones. He is the CEO and founder of Public Religion Research Institute and a leading scholar on religion and politics. He writes regularly on politics, culture, and religion. And his writing is frequently featured in major national media. I was delighted last month to come across an article he wrote entitled "White Christian America Needs a Moral Awakening." And that title itself was intriguing. It reminded me of James Baldwin, and we're going to talk a little bit about James Baldwin. But Robert is also on the National Program Committee of the American Academy of Religion, and he holds a PhD in religion from Emory University, an MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a BS in computing science and mathematics from Mississippi College. That's a lot. This book, this study really draws on history and public opinion surveys and also personal experience to examine this relationship between white supremacy and American Christianity. And what I appreciate is that it also issues an urgent call. It's not just a conversation, a discussion of the facts, but it also issues a very compelling call for Christians to reckon with this legacy of racism and faith. So welcome, Robert. So glad that I get a chance to talk with you tonight.
I'm so glad to be here. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. I want to acknowledge up front at the top of our conversation, because I know that we're both feeling the weight of today's decision down in Louisville, Kentucky on the Breonna Taylor case. And, you know, what an opportunity, however, for us to use this moment to engage in this kind of conversation. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, very heavy. I mean, I've been been in conversation with friends in Louisville today who are all, I think, sad and worried and, a lot of unrest, a lot of anger, a lot of pain, and I think just, concerned and fatigued, at these events and particularly just, the concerns around racial justice and, I think with the Breonna Taylor thing here that that we don't have an indictment of someone who actually shot and killed her in her own apartment. And I think there's a lot of people feeling just dismayed and angry about that. And yeah, I think it's worth acknowledging that. We're going to talk about that as we go. But I'm really happy to say her name and just name this thing I think's on so many of our minds before we jump into this larger conversation.
Yeah. I do want to stay here for a moment longer because I mentioned that this is a mixture of history and this compelling research, the statistics, but it's also for you a bit of a memoir. Like this is a personal undertaking for you. And so I want to start there. Why are you a privileged white American Christian man, child of the Southern Baptist Convention denomination? Like, why are you writing about the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity? What does that mean for you right now?
Yeah. You said it is a personal book. So just a little bit about me. I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, as a Southern Baptist, and I was really involved. I mean, I was that kid who was at church like 5 days a week. Every time it was open, I was there. I was active in the youth group, kind of in a leadership role. And then I went to a Southern Baptist college, and then I went to a Southern Baptist seminary. So I got a degree in a Master of Divinity degree from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. I think part of this is a reckoning of my own in a way, and kind of putting down on the page a way of thinking through my own evolution and my own journey on many of these issues. And so to start with, I think one of the things that I have realized certainly in writing this is how utterly invisible racism, white supremacy was rendered to me as a kid and growing up, white and Christian in Mississippi. And that is true, even though I grew up, I remember I was in elementary school in the 1970s, for example, when the first African-American kids came to my all white school. And that's a good 2 decades after Brown v. Board of Education, of course, but Mississippi drug its feet for nearly 2 decades on finally getting around to integrate the public schools. Mm-hmm. And even though I was living through that moment, there was no reflection, no commentary at my church. I can't remember hearing a single sermon on civil rights, racial justice, what was even going on in our own schools right around us, why that was happening. There was no conversation whatsoever. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s in a seminary class that I even understood the origin of my own denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention. And that is that, we were the denomination formed in 1845 explicitly over the issue of slavery. And the issue was that there was a rift between Northern and Southern Baptists over whether clergy could enslave other human beings and still be in good standing as Christian clergy. And the Northern Baptists rejected that view, and the many Southern Baptists in the South, who thought it was perfectly consistent to be not only Christian but a Christian leader and enslave other human beings because of the color of their skin. That was the normative view that was the founding principle of the Southern Baptist Convention in 1845. And I didn't know that until I was in my 20s. I mean, that history had been hidden even from those of us who were the most active in our own denomination. So between that sort of repressed history and then just absolutely no attention at all to systemic injustice, civil rights, or even the role of white churches in resisting segregation of their own congregations and in resisting the desegregation of the schools, none of that was on the plate. And so I think this has been a long journey, a long evolution just in my own life. And I think the events of the last 5 years, or a little more even, the killing of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, this kind of just litany of things, Dylan Roof killing 9 African-Americans in Charleston, and who was a self-professed Christian, right? We should be calling him a white Christian terrorist, but that's not language that really got used around him. And I think this amnesia or this kind of myopic view of white Christianity's role is I think a story that I needed to tell for myself, I think that we need to tell for the sake of the health of not only the faith, but the country.
Mm-hmm. We talk about origins, and you talked about the origin even of the Southern Baptist Convention. I'm wondering, because I've always thought that Christianity, white Christianity in the United States, really learned how to be as violent as possible from its experience with Native Americans. And I wonder if you are looking at really sort of the birth defect of America and the real problem with American Christianity, why not start with an examination of the subjugation of indigenous peoples?
Mm-hmm.
Why begin with black, white?
Well, I think it has to do partly with the book being written as a memoir, right? And that this was really primarily my experience. So I really tried to ground the examples that I used in things that were connected, to me, sort of my experience. When I do talk about, though, the deeper history of my own family, though, back in Middle Georgia. So my both sides of my family actually go back 6 generations, back to the early 1800s in Georgia. And when at the end of the book, I kind of say, look, we all need to learn how to tell truer stories, like about ourselves and how we got here, truer stories about our family. And when I tell my family's story there, it does begin with the kind of best documentation I have, with the arrival of my ancestors, again, both sides of my family, sometime around the turn of the 1800s. And they're arriving on land that has been forcibly cleared of its original Native American inhabitants, right? And they're, we often use these words like pioneers and, those kinds of things, white settlers and these kinds of language. But I mean, they were inheriting, they got a 200-acre plot of land that was carved up in a nice, neat little square, but that had been after, widespread Native American removals, that they then made that land available to people like my 6th great-grandfather who had served in the Revolutionary War. That's what he got as kind of part of his benefits was Native American land in Georgia that he was able to. So I mean that story is certainly there. I mean the other I think piece of this is that white Christianity doesn't invent this sense of white supremacy when it lands on the shores of the U.S. It goes much further back than that. You can go back as far as the 15th century, even prior to the Protestant Reformation, with the doctrine of discovery, which is 1493, which we have a papal edict that says if white European missionaries and explorers show up on other lands that are occupied by people who do not practice the Christian faith, they can forcibly take those lands and consider that to be condoned by the church and by God. And so this was 1493, right? And this is like way back. And so the doctrine of manifest destiny, this sense of kind of entitlement, and that it's not just sort of that it's divinely ordained, right? It really is seen to be the will of God, right? That this is the role of white Europeans in the world, is to quote unquote civilize others and to see themselves at the top of the racial hierarchy. It's all the way back. So it's built in even as white Christians, land on the shores of the early colonies here in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. So in your own journey, what came first? Like, were you looking digging into your own story, or did the research come first and it led you to look deeper into your own story? What came first?
Yeah, I think it's hard to really put a finger on it. Really, I mean, I think like many people, it's a kind of organic process. I would certainly say the seeds of it are, my parents, who very clearly, while they weren't like political activists and weren't overtly kind of, I think, educating us, to be anti-racist, but they were certainly putting some distance between my brother, my sister, and I. And the Jim Crow South that they grew up in, in Macon, Georgia. So I think having that buffer that gave me just enough critical distance, I think, to kind of see it from the outside and not be so immersed with it that it's hard to see out of it. I think that was absolutely critical. I think having, professors that were really important in my life, and a Baptist professor at a Southern Baptist seminary, who in fact was the first Baptist professor to put in a textbook the real reason for the founding of the denomination. That textbook was published in the 1980s. Like, that tells you how late it was, that even, a Baptist historian would be frank about the cause of the Civil War, a guy named Leon Macbeth. So I owe, and then, and a lot of cognitive dissonance for decades that I think I sat with, and coming in and out of view, very messy in a process. I do think that, it's crystallized more. I think my graduate education certainly, helped, reading, tons of folks like Cone and Cornell West, and, many other folks that certainly I didn't have connections with growing up. So reading a lot of African-American theology that really did change my views on some of this. And then I think the last 5 years have really been critical, where, I think things that even previous to 5 years would have been, there certainly were there. They hadn't gone away. But things that I think were either whispered or said in dog whistle code words coming out right into the open, right? Where we see white supremacy just right in front of us without apology. Those chants in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us, blood and soil, the neo-Nazi slants. And again, like Dylan Roof murdering 9 African Americans at Bible study, right? And doing it in the name of his own twisted version of white Christianity. I mean, it was very much wrapped up in his religious views, not just in his racist views. These were one and the same thing for him. And trying to take that really seriously and ask ourselves, okay, like, if we're going to reckon with this, like, how do we start doing that? How do we start telling the truth? And I think we mentioned Baldwin at the top of the show here. Baldwin, I think, was also someone I read who really changed my mind about many things. I would say opened my eyes. And one of the things I think he challenged me to do was to do what he saw his own writing doing, and that was bearing witness. Like, he kind of used this Christian language of bearing witness to the truth as best he could see it. And I think that's one of the most admirable things about him, in addition to his immense gifts as a writer, was his courage and willingness to just not flinch and tell us the truth as straight as he could see it. And I think I certainly have been kind of challenged and inspired to try to do the same thing from where I sit. And so I think a lot of the book I do see as just trying to bear witness to the truth in a way that might start a different set of conversations and actions that can hopefully get us to a different place.
I believe it will. Before we get to your research, because I do want to give some time to that, and then I see that there are questions already popping up, so that we can frame this, like, how are you defining white supremacy? And how are you defining whiteness? And then, we can jump into your research.
Yeah. Well, white supremacy, I'll start there. I kind of wrestled a little bit with kind of using the term, mostly because I know that most white people, when they hear the term, think, oh, that's not me, right? There's kind of this immediate defensive reaction, and people think, oh, that's the KKK, that's people burning crosses, that's people lynching people, that has nothing to do with me. And so kind of inoculate themselves from kind of thinking any further about it. I'll borrow a term from Eddie Glaude, who's a professor of African American Studies and Religion at Princeton, who wrote in Democracy in Black, a really great book I'll recommend, as well as he's a new book on James Baldwin, actually, called Begin Again. It's fantastic. But he talked about white supremacy, quote, without all the bluster. And I think that's a good way of thinking about it. It's something much more common, much more banal, really. And so even if we just flip the words around, and instead of white supremacy, where we kind of have this reaction often, we think about it as the supremacy of whites, and just unpack that a little bit further and make it communal and social. And that is kind of, being in support of a social arrangement that protects and values the lives of whites at the expense of others. I think is really what I mean by that. And if you think about it that way, and you think about everything from restrictive neighborhood covenants that protected all white neighborhoods and better areas of the city, pushed African American neighborhoods near industrial centers and flood zones, like those kinds of things, with worse schools, restricting certain jobs, certain benefits, who could get loans, who couldn't. I mean, it's economic, it's social, it's cultural, it's kind of all the way down. And there's really no way of reading American history straight without realizing that that has plagued us for all of our history. It's with us today. Even with COVID-19, right? We have 200,000 deaths, but those deaths aren't evenly distributed. African American, Latino Americans are twice as likely as whites to have been infected and die of the disease. And I think a lot of the complacency we're seeing among whites, particularly, is really linked to that. That this has impacted communities of color much more than that. And on the issue of whiteness, it's sometimes they use a phrase like, those of us who have grown up thinking of ourselves as white, as one way of kind of thinking about the construct. It's again, Baldwin, I think, here is really instructive. And, he talks really about the power that whiteness in particular has had in the American context, right? So, he's like, look, when people came over from Germany to America, in Germany, those people were German. In France, they were French. In Britain, they were British. And, and in Denmark, they were Danes. It's only when they get to America that there is this kind of umbrella category of whiteness that really takes hold. And what it really means, right, is entrance to a protected, privileged category where many rights and privileges are kind of constrained here, and everyone else is kind of kept out. And it's also worth noting, I mean, how elastic this category has been throughout American history. So Jews historically not white, Italians not white, Irish not white. Even on the official U.S. Census forms, well into the 20th century. I mean, if you were Irish, you had to check Celt. If you were Jewish, you had to check Hebrew. You couldn't check Caucasian. Like that was not your box. These categories have kind of expanded. But always, I think whiteness has been about a kind of protected class that is kind of protected as the top of the pyramid, and certain rights, privileges, and powers reserved for those who could make a claim to that category.
Yeah. So in your book, you contend that that white American Christianity's theological core is what protects, it's this structured, protected interest. And so what is that theology? What is that theology that serves to protect this supremacy and whiteness, or the supremacy of whites?
Yeah, so it's a big claim. So I mean, I make a claim in the book that that white Christianity hasn't just been complicit, right? It's not just been sort of an incidental thing, but that it has been actively involved in perpetuating, this idea of white supremacy in the country. And one of the ways of kind of thinking about that is just that it has Christianity has been part of the sort of dominant culture among people of European descent. And so, not surprisingly, it has been the tool that has been used to legitimize this worldview. And there's no greater legitimacy you can give something than to claim that it is divinely ordained by the creator of the universe, right? That is one of the most powerful claims you can make about something being legitimate. I mean, who can argue with that, right? If you can really make the case that the creator of the universe has in fact ordained this particular thing. And that was precisely the argument that was made, really. And so it was built in very early. Again, all the way back from the 15th century forward, this has been under the hood of the kind of engine of white Christianity. It's been entangled. And it's been done for so long, I kind of argue in the book, that it's actually become embedded really in the DNA of white Christianity today. And we can still see it today. But to the point of, so it's not surprising that it's really gotten connected to the theology here in so many ways. And it's not that surprising if you think about what early church looked like in the American colonies that were either supportive of or tolerated the enslavement of other human beings. And in many of those churches, what you had was whites who had enslaved others, bringing enslaved people to church with them, whites sitting in the front, enslaved people sitting in the back. And if you ask yourself, well, okay, what kind of sermon could get preached in that environment? What kind of prayer could get prayed in that environment? What scriptures would get read and which ones would absolutely not get read in that environment? It tells you a lot about the early shape of lived Christianity in the country, and that legacy that was built there, for centuries, not surprisingly, is still with us today. I mean, we've hardly begun to reform the theology. And just one example here, a biblical one, this text of that was used well into the 20th century about the mark of Ham or the mark of Cain, which really did, again, reinforce this white supremacist worldview. And the way it went was this, that the explanation for the existence of dark-skinned people in the world can be traced to this story of Cain murdering his brother Abel. And when God comes and says, what's happened to your brother? And he sort of first denies it, but then God finally pins him down and says, okay, you've killed your brother. And he marks Cain. And the text really doesn't say anything about skin color. He just says that he gives him a mark. It doesn't say anything other than that. But white Christians and clergy begin to interpret that passage as the origin of dark-skinned people in the world. Now, what that does, right, is it then gives white Christians one lineage that goes back to Adam and Eve, that is a very noble one, right? That of people that the Creator formed with the Creator's own hands, and the origin of dark-skinned people in the world is a criminal act.
Yeah.
It is literally the murder of one's own brother. And so there is this kind of tracing the lineage back to not to an original being that the Creator crafted with their own with the Creator's own hands, but with someone who created a criminal act, and then that justified then this moral hierarchy, even, right? That whites had this kind of more noble history, dark-skinned people had this morally suspect history, and then you just read that into the current thing. There's many others I could give, but I mean, I think those were, I think to the modern ear, some that may sound a little ridiculous, but it was, I mean, this was well into the 20th century. You can find these passages being cited in exactly this way.
Yeah. Well, it's not lost on me that even this summer, the Baptist Calvinists, like, Tom Nettles and Albert Mohler, not at the seminary that you went to, but Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, who suggest that for enslaved peoples to run away was immoral on Christian grounds. And that's 2020. And they're still arguing and contending.
I mean, last month too, I mean, Eric Metaxas, who's one of the best-selling authors in the evangelical world, was with a straight face arguing that Jesus was white. I mean, on Twitter was having this like epic battle about Jesus being white, like literally, which is clearly an odd thing for someone who's a biblical literalist to say. But given that what the Bible does say about his origins, the Middle Eastern Jew, but nonetheless, this was the argument that was being made. Yeah, exactly. In 2020. So it's really not that far back there.
So let's talk about the racial attitudes of whites today and this racism index that you have created. Like, tell us about that.
Yeah, all right. You want to put on my social science hat?
Yeah.
Here. So at the heart of the book, I think is trying to figure out how does this show up for us today, right? So it's one thing to kind of tell this history, even if it's very recent history, as we've been talking about, but how can we really think about measuring this legacy and again, kind of maybe testing it for the DNA, kind of its existence in the DNA of white Christianity today. So it's a little bit challenging with public opinion data to measure kind of racist attitudes because you can't exactly ask people directly about that. But what I did was I built what I called a racism index that is a collection of 15 different questions. So it's a lot of questions, more than a dozen questions that cover a lot of different ground, everything from the police treatment of African Americans, criminal kind of disproportionate sentencing in the criminal justice program, system, the economic mobility, all kinds of other kinds of structural racism issues. And what I found in that there is this massive gap among whites, and I think I'll start there. This gap between whites, those on the one hand who claim to be Christian of any kind. I mean, so not just evangelical, but who claim to be mainline Protestant Christian, and those are kind of the more liberal end of the white Protestant world, like Episcopalians, Presbyterians, United Methodists, and white Catholics who have their own history of discrimination in the country. But what I found was, so I scored this index on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 holding the least racist attitudes and 10 holding the most racist attitudes. And what I found is that white evangelicals, again, who have been heavily, in the South, perhaps not surprisingly, scored 8 out of 10 on this racism index. But what's maybe more surprising than that is that white mainline Protestants and white Catholics scored 7 out of 10 on this racism index. And if you look at whites who are not Christian, now I think this really shows you the work that Christianity is doing. If you look at whites who are not Christian, they only score 4 out of 10 on this, and African Americans are at 2, right? So if you ask the question, like, who is closer to the views of African Americans on these questions of systemic racism and their experiences of systemic racism, white Christians are not the answer. Whites who are not Christian is the answer to that question. And it turns out that this is actually quite a robust relationship, that even when I controlled, for example, for a bunch of other possible alternative explanations, so maybe it's that they're more Republican, and that's why this correlation exists. Or maybe it's because they live in more rural areas. Maybe it's education levels. Maybe it's gender. Maybe it's, region of the country. I check for all kinds of this, and even controlling for all of those factors, this independent relationship between holding more racist attitudes and identifying as white and Christian holds up. So it tells you that it's actually the Christianity piece that is doing the work. And just one more, I think, piece on this that was, I think, surprising, is that I think you might also think, okay, well, maybe it's just these people are just Christian in name only. So maybe they don't really go to church. Maybe they haven't been discipled, or they're not in worship services just claiming to be Christian. But even when I looked at attendance patterns, what I found is that at best, religious attendance made absolutely no difference. And so in other words, people who attended less, white Christians who attended less frequently, were just as likely to hold racist attitudes as those who attended more frequently. And if I just look at white evangelicals, the kind of group that I grew up in, it actually is quite remarkable that actually attending church more frequently made people hold more racist attitudes, right? So in other words, this relationship between holding racist attitudes and identifying as a white evangelical was stronger among high church attenders than it was among low church attenders. And I think this tells you just how deep this problem goes. Again, it's not just white evangelicals in the South, but it is white mainline that are more populous in the Midwest and the Northeast, and white Catholics who are even more urban, in the Northeast as well.
But you contend this really hasn't been a North-South kind of thing, that this has been a white Christian thing, North, South, East, and West.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me, just quickly on this point, also read a fair amount of Frederick Douglass, working on the book. And one of the things that he was most dismayed about after the Civil War is he basically writes that he thought the issue of slavery, that settling the issue of slavery, ending this practice, would have a great effect on people's attitudes around white supremacy in general. And he was dismayed that was not actually the case, that actually many whites saw slavery as one thing and white supremacy as something completely different. And one example I'll give, that's actually from the state of New York, is Charles Finney, who was a white Presbyterian minister, and he was a staunch abolitionist, and was, debated people on the issue of slavery, spent a lot of time organizing. And once that question was settled, though, he had a young protege who was approaching him about organizing an integrated worship service. And he stopped him in his tracks and he said, no, you misunderstand. The issue of abolition and amalgamation are not the same thing. And basically said, I'm for abolishing slavery. We are not for mixing the races, in this way, and was still hanging on to this. And I think that actually was also, for me, really important insight, that the Civil War did virtually nothing to settle the issue of white supremacy. The Civil Rights Movement did very little to settle the issue of white supremacy, and that we have really not reckoned with that underlying issue. We have, Baldwin talked about, the bill coming due, and we have not been willing to pay it. And I think here we are again, in many ways, with this another moment of reckoning, which is, I think, another moment of opportunity for us really to finally deal with these debts that we have incurred by not really being honest and telling the truth about how white supremacy has been with us, and being willing to commit to finally, excising it from our midst.
Mm-hmm. I've heard many people comment that maybe in the last, 4 months or so, particularly after the George Floyd case, that maybe white attitudes have changed. But I know that you've done some research since then, and maybe that's not the case.
Yeah, it's a really mixed bag. On the one hand, we did see in the early weeks after George Floyd's murder, white attitudes and white Christian attitudes actually being fairly positive on the Black Lives Matter movement, and much more so than they had been back in 2015, for sure. And even anecdotally, like I'm here in Maryland, just outside of DC, and I have a friend who's a pastor of a UCC church, and in 2015 he put out a Black Lives Matter sign on his church that got vandalized and burned 3 separate times. And I think that's not what we're seeing now. I mean, we're seeing much more acceptance and support, I think, even among predominantly white churches for the Black Lives Matter movement. But the more recent data that we've seen has shown that these gaps that I mentioned before are largely still with us. I mean, on the specific question of the killing of African Americans by police, for example, we are still seeing a 25 percentage point gap between white Christians of all kinds, again, not just evangelicals, who are majority saying these are just isolated incidents with a few bad apples. They're not part of a pattern. They're not part of systemic racism in the country. Whereas whites who are not Christian, majorities, strong majorities, saying, no, these are part of a pattern, and agreeing with African Americans. And on the issues of Confederate flags and monuments, we're actually seeing attitudes move in really the wrong direction. In other words, white Christians are actually become more insistent that the Confederate flag and the Confederate monuments are actually just signs of Southern pride and not symbols of racism. And those attitudes have actually moved 5 or 6 points the wrong way. And then in just the last month, we've seen some slippage among whites overall, white Christians included, in support for Black Lives Matter. So we've seen some support go up over the summer, and in the last month, we've seen some of that taper off and flag a bit in the last few weeks. And as we've probed underneath that, even doing some focus groups on this, what we're finding is that many white Christians are, I think, mixed and have really bought into the idea that the protests are largely violent, and are becoming more sympathetic to kind of a law and order kind of argument that they're hearing from President Trump.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to just go back to Baldwin for a moment, and then there are a lot of questions in this chat, so we're going to get to those also. He was really good at turning, notions on the head, with you and the supremacy of whites and not white supremacy. In 1963, he did this interview where basically he said the great victims of in this country of the institution called segregation is white people. Mm-hmm. Basically, he's saying is we don't have a Black problem, we have a white problem. And then in this conversation with Lorraine Hansberry, he's referring to a conversation with Lorraine Hansberry, and they're talking about the specter of Black people being brutalized and white people watching this brutalization and not feeling anything. Mm-hmm. And so he says, the quote is, these people don't think I'm human. And this means that they have become themselves moral monsters. And so like, what about what of your conclusions do you think might contribute to white American Christians saving themselves from the fate of being
Yeah,
moral monsters?
that goes, I think, right to the heart of the matter. I'm gonna read one more Baldwin quote back to you here, because I think it's actually where the title of my book comes from. So, "White Too Long" is actually from a quote from James Baldwin, and he, I think for most of his, writing in the 60s, he like King, I think, was kind of optimistic. He was hopeful that whites would ultimately step up, right? That whites would ultimately see the cause. And after King is assassinated, and after Bobby Kennedy is assassinated, he writes this next passage I'm about to read from a real moment of kind of despondency. I think after that hopefulness, and after seeing King cut down, and even after King's assassinated, there's not this great uprising among white Christians to the cause. And he says this. This is where the quote, the title comes from. "I will flatly say that the bulk of this country's white population impresses me, and has so impressed me for a very long time, as being beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation.
Mm-hmm.
They have been white, if I may put it, too long. The effect on their personalities, their lives, their grasp of reality has been as devastating as the lava which so memorably immobilized the citizens of Pompeii. They are unable to conceive that their version of reality, which they want me to accept, is an insult to my history and a parody of theirs and an intolerable violation of myself."
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's very consistent, with what you were reading. And, and at the end of the book, I do talk about this, and, there are reasons to really embark on this work of reckoning that have to do with justice to people that we have wronged. I mean, that's very clear. Justice and repair is a real motivating factor, and a moral cause that ought to be very salient. But beyond that, there is great. This is not a merely altruistic project, I think, for the reasons that you say. Like, if we really want to ask, like, whose religion has been twisted and deformed, like, whose perceptions of reality have been warped, it's not African Americans, right? It's white people's perceptions that have been, Baldwin even talks about it as almost a kind of madness, that is kind of taken in by having to live with these kind of deep cognitive dissonance between a commitment to white supremacy and a commitment to Christianity, and making these things compatible for centuries, right, has really, that does damage to one's psyche and to one's mental health and moral health. And if you want to speak in theological languages, it damages one's soul. Yeah. And so I think that in itself, right, there's an internal reason for white Christians to take up this work that isn't about just, you hear this like just being politically correct and all that, but it is really about, if we think seriously about, like, what kind of a faith are we going to hand to our kids and to our grandchildren? It is about, like, faithfulness in the present and integrity in the future. I mean, it is something that is very internal to white Christians and the whole future of the faiths. I mean, there is enormous amounts of things at stake here, not just for us, but for our kids and our grandchildren.
Mm-hmm. I want to go to some of the questions. There's one: how do you suggest structuring conversations that advance critical self-reflection on race within white Christian communities when they are most often utterly devoid of diversity? What scriptural texts do you draw upon?
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is that I think that's exactly right. I mean, the latest data I've looked at is that it's about 85% of churches that are essentially monoracial today. It's a little better than the past, but not much. I mean, Martin Luther King's note that 11 a.m. on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America is still largely true. And so I think that's a challenge here. But one thing I would say is that there is some work that white Christians can do, even in a very homogeneous environment. And I'm going to say something, like personal here. I think one of the things that I did just as a personal practice when I was first starting working on the book was I just journaled a bit, and I asked myself a question that only someone who grew up thinking themselves as white can ask. And that is, where did race even show up for me as a kid, as an adolescent? That question is like nonsensical to anyone who hasn't grown up thinking themselves as white, because it's everywhere. But for those of us who grew up thinking themselves as white, race was sort of, by design, rendered somewhat invisible. And so bringing that to consciousness and bringing that forward, I think, was an important part of the work. And what happened with me, I think, is that once I started sort of catching one thread and I just pulled that one thread, it was connected to other stuff and it just began to unravel. And so I think just beginning that process and then being willing to do that in community, right? So that's an individual process. But then can you tell the truth about that? Can you tell a story about that to people you're in community with? Can you share those stories? Because once you do, it's going to engender other stories. And just one from my own family's upbringing, even in talking with my own parents about, many of this history that I have in the book, there were things that came out that I didn't know. And probably had I not even started the conversation, my parents probably would have gone to their grave with it. Like, for example, I found out that there was this practice in the 1960s as churches were resisting integration of their own congregations, that they would actually station deacons on the outside steps of the church at the beginning of the service to prevent any African Americans from entering the building, and to prevent any mixed group from coming in and integrating the service. And I found out that my grandfather was one of those guys. He was a deacon at East Macon Baptist Church. And that was one of his jobs on Sunday morning, was to kind of stand out there and basically be not only a deacon, but a bouncer, outside the church. And so I think we start telling these stories. And then I think for white Christian churches, a couple of simple questions. One simple question, for example, is if every white Christian church in America were honest about this question: why is our church located geographically where it is? You would very quickly get to race and most of the answers to those questions. If it's an older church, it's probably in an area of the city that was designated a whites only part of the city. If it's a newer church, it's out in the suburbs or exurbs. Why there and not back in the city? Why in this suburb rather than another? It's mostly because this is where there were white people, right? For us to kind of build a church that was essentially all white. So I think being honest about those conversations, and then I think trying to do the hard work of building some community, because there's a lot of work that can be done there. But I think ultimately it is going to have to be rebuilding ties and rebuilding community with African-American churches and institutions where there can be, and I talk about in the book a couple of churches that are trying to do this work. And it's messy and there's no real blueprint for it, but kind of stumbling their way along with a commitment to build community and to be honest there. And I think all of those things kind of move together. There's no 10-step program here, I think, but it's not actually that hard, because this history, both personal and public, is actually not, it's just like you scratch the surface a little bit. It's right there. I just have to be willing to kind of open ourselves up to it.
Mm-hmm. I'm seeing sort of a theme also in some of the questions where people really are expressing fear. They're wondering, what do they do? how do they start? And so there was one in particular I was trying to pull up. It says, what do you say to those of us, white and non-white, who are afraid of those with malevolent intent? He says, I'm a Jew born and raised in the cocoon of New York City, and I've never been so afraid of the country's direction.
Yeah, well, I mean, we just did some focus groups, like I said, and I think we were hearing this too. People are confused, people are afraid. And I think it's true that many of the things that have been submerged are just now out on the surface, right? So I think in some ways these aren't new, right? These aren't new fault lines. They're just out for all of us to see. And I actually think that there's something, even as scary as that is, I do want to say I think there's something hopeful in that, right? Again, that you can't really address something that you can't see and that you can't name. So I think if there's any virtue in these just open conflicts, is that it does give us an opportunity to name what's actually in front of us, and to try to really deal with it. I do think it's going to take some courage on all of our parts, I think, to really stand up. And I really do think the first chapter of the book is titled Seeing, Seeing. And I think that is really the first step. And in order to see something, we have to tell the truth about it. And I think particularly for those of us who are white and Christian, it's pretty clear, what that is. And I think we have to say, and we're going to stand in the gap. We're going to stand in solidarity to our Jewish brothers and sisters, right? When I heard in Charlottesville, and I'm sure every, Jewish person in America, when I heard that, literally chanting, Jews will not replace us, right? While holding tiki torches and marching around the statue of Robert E. Lee. That is no joke. That is serious. We've seen an uptick in hate crimes, an uptick in hate groups. These are all documented by multiple ADL, Southern Poverty Law Center, have all documented these trends. So it's really real here. But I think the underlying sickness, is something we've never really dealt with. And so I think these are the symptoms. We got to get to the source. The source really is this underlying commitment to white supremacy that really has been undergirding, so much of white Christianity and so much of our laws and even, are still with us today.
There's a question: what has been the response to your book from evangelical Christians, mainline Protestants, and Catholics?
Yeah, well, as you might imagine, it's been a wide range of responses. I'm happy to say that it's probably been, 3 or 5 to 1 positive. And I don't know really what to make of that, but that's been about what it has been. I've certainly gotten plenty of angry phone calls and emails. Thankfully, no death threats at this point, but certainly, angry things. But I think it is because, this is real. It's a real thing we're dealing with here, and it's a real moment of reckoning. That I should say also that I would not have anticipated, again, when I turned the manuscript in a year ago, that we'd be at a moment like this. When I turned this manuscript in Richmond, I spent some time in Richmond doing research, and I walked down Monument Avenue in Richmond past 5 massive Confederate monuments. And the statues of 4 of the 5 of those are now gone, just all gone over the summer. A year ago, the Mississippi state flag had the Confederate battle flag in it. That's now gone. So I think there's some real signs that not only the kind of chaos and the scary things are happening, but I think there are some signs that some real positive change is taking root. And I think we've got to kind of make sure we're putting our energies really toward certainly resisting, things we need to resist, but also in kind of pushing forward, I think, these positive changes.
Yeah. So along those lines, you talk about in the book traveling the country as you're doing the research and learning about groups who, on the national and local level, who were trying to tell a more truthful story about America's past, trying to deal with the shape that that past, has sort of created and are imagining a better, future. So who were those groups?
Yeah, well, they range from the local, to a few denominations. I will say the Episcopal denomination has, which I should say also was, the denomination of Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. That was their denominational home. And there are, for example, in Richmond, Episcopal churches that have stained glass windows dedicated in the church to Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson. Right here they are. Here's Jesus and Moses, and here's the Confederate Trinity over here. But there have been doing some serious things on reparations, for example, like Virginia Theological Seminary has put together more than $1 million in kind of reparations fund. I know that the Episcopal denomination is doing more of that. I mentioned these 2 Baptist churches in Macon that I kind of profile that used to be the same church. They were that situation I described earlier of whites who brought enslaved people to church with them and then split and have been ignoring each other. They've been kind of in existence for 150 years around the corner. And in the last 7 years, really have made a courageous move to try to build community there. And it's really been I think life-changing for the people in the pews, and I think particularly transformative for the white Christian church, as they've been really challenged to tell the full truth about it and to try to think about what repair really means. And I want to make sure I get that in, as I do think too often white Christians, and maybe whites in general, think that the goal is reconciliation. And I think reach for that really quickly. And one of the reasons why we reach for that really quickly is that it's really uncomfortable to sit in a place of confession and lament and apology, right? That's just totally right. But what that move does is it skips often the work of repair. So the formula for many white Christians, I think, has been white lament and apology in exchange for black forgiveness equals reconciliation, right? And we're done. But I think that if there's something I've learned from watching, I think many of these groups that are really doing the work, it is that what really is required, particularly on the white Christian side of things, is the work of repair and justice. In fact, one of the white minister, Scott Dickinson, in that church in Macon, said he stopped talking about reconciliation. And I actually think that's a great idea, actually, for white Christians to just stop talking about reconciliation. Because here's the thing. If we talked about and did the work of justice and repair long enough, I'm pretty sure our African-American brothers and sisters will tell us when we're reconciled, right? It'll come as an organic outgrowth, right? It'll be something that's real and that actually happens as a result of the work that we're actually doing on the ground.
Yeah. Dr. Shanika Walker Barnes, in her book, I Bring the Voices of My People With Me, and she's talking about racial reconciliation from a Black womanist perspective. And the image that she describes of just how we get this wrong is that we see this sort of as, pack a football stadium with like thousands of Black men and white men, and they hug it out.
Oh, right. Yeah.
They just hug it out, and then we're reconciled. But the white man goes back on, to his life, and the Black man goes back on to his life. But they've thought that they think that they have done something that has reconciled them when they haven't. Yeah. So we are at time. I want to give you the last word. I want to, encourage everybody. Please come into the chat and to follow the link so that you can purchase. And what would you say? What would be your last word? Yeah,
I'm gonna say like one word to challenge. I think I'm looking at the chat too, and one word to challenge. I think to my fellow white Christians here is this. I think we often think when we think at all about the civil rights movement, I think we often like to think that we would have been on the right side of that equation and the right side of that action. And I'll say this: like whatever we're doing right now is what we would have been doing in the civil rights movement. So I think kind of holding ourselves accountable to that. If we want to think of ourselves as being on the right side, then let's make sure we're on the right side now. And then the last thing I'll say, I think I'm going to give the last word to James Baldwin, actually, because I think this is amazing, quote that, he talked about bearing witness to the truth as the first step toward healing. And that if we can find the courage and the love, I think, to do that, and these are his words, we will end the racial nightmare, we will achieve our country, and we can change the history of the world.
Amen. Amen. Robert Jones, thank you for talking.
Thank you.
Tonight. Thank you for writing this book. Take care of yourself.
Thanks so much. Thanks for being here.